If one signal in your body starts getting ignored, what if that single glitch quietly drags down your heart, your liver, and even your brain before you ever feel sick? That's the unsettling idea here. Insulin resistance may not be one disease at all, but the hidden code running underneath a whole bunch of them. And once you see it, the question becomes almost disturbing. What if we've been treating the symptoms while missing the thing that connects them all? Let's get into the conversation. Bro, the scary part is he's saying insulin resistance sits under everything. Not just diabetes, but heart disease, fatty liver, even brain stuff. That feels almost too neat, like a master key for every lock. And yet the more he talks, the more it sounds annoyingly plausible. The big idea is simple, right? Cells stop listening to insulin. Which is rude, honestly, because insulin is just trying to do its job. It's the body telling the delivery guy, not today, man. But then the body sends more insulin, and the whole thing snowballs. That part matters because high insulin is both cause and consequence. Which is so annoying because people only look at sugar numbers. They patch the branch and ignore the tree. That tree metaphor is actually brutal because it lands. And he's saying the same root shows up everywhere in different tissues. Brain, blood vessels, ovaries, even erections, like all of it. The body is basically one embarrassing group chat. But that's the point. It's systemic, not a single organ problem. I liked the insulin as taxi thing because it's stupidly clear. Taxi, shuttle, bouncer. He kept changing metaphors like a man possessed. Fair though, people need a lot of metaphors to survive biology. Muscle and fat need insulin to pull glucose in, that's the basic gate. But the liver is weird because it can just take stuff in. So insulin is less a key for every door and more a traffic controller. Yes, and that wider job is why this thing touches so many systems. The erectile dysfunction example was wild because it's blood vessel biology. He's basically saying the vessels stop responding to the insulin signal, which means the symptom looks sexual, but the mechanism is metabolic. That is exactly why medicine gets trapped treating the headline, not the cause. More pills, same tree, different branch. The fast versus slow insulin resistance split was interesting to me, because 6 hours to make someone resistant is kind of insane. Stress, inflammation, and too much insulin can flip it fast. The stress one makes sense because cortisol and adrenaline push glucose up. The body thinks it needs emergency fuel, so insulin has to fight harder. Your body is like, run first, process later. And inflammation does the same thing. Even a bad infection can spike glucose, which means being sick temporarily can make you metabolically worse, temporarily. The third fast cause, too much insulin itself, is the sneaky one. Because the body eventually gets tired of hearing the same signal non-stop. Like a kid saying mom 1,000 times and getting ghosted by biology. That is exactly what it sounded like, and somehow it was funny and sad. The slow lane is where the real modern disaster seems to live. Because we're basically eating all day, every day, never letting insulin rest. Breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack, that schedule is unhinged. We turned human metabolism into customer service with no closing time. And then the fat cells get bigger, and that creates another loop. His point wasn't just that you have more fat, but that fat cells expand, which is why the same body fat percentage can mean different metabolic risk. The ethnicity point was one of the most provocative things he said. Fewer fat cells early on means those cells hit trouble sooner when fat rises. So the same extra weight can hit one person way harder than another. That makes population averages look so misleading because the biology differs. And it means the simple advice people love is often too blunt. The fat cell part got really interesting when he said the cells are long-lived. So adults mostly aren't creating endless new fat cells, they're inflating existing ones. Which makes liposuction sound less like a fix and more like a hack. And he basically said it can make things worse, which is wild. Because if you remove fat cells, the remaining ones can still overgrow. The vanity move doesn't solve the storage problem. The body is not impressed by cosmetic surgery, apparently. The calories versus insulin thing is where people get emotionally destroyed. Because it says calories matter, but only inside the hormone context. A type 1 diabetic skipping insulin can eat absurd calories and still not get fat. That absolutely wrecks the lazy calories are everything slogan. Not that calories are fake, but they're not the whole steering wheel. I thought the Petri dish experiment was the cleanest proof. Same nutrients, add insulin, and the cells start fattening up. That's such a savage little lab demo. It makes insulin sound like the permission slip for storage. And then low insulin does the opposite. It pushes fat burning. Even ketones get dumped out in breath and urine like wasted fuel. That part almost sounds inefficient, but it's deliberate. The body is choosing to spend energy instead of storing it, which is why lower insulin can raise metabolic rate by a lot. His evolution angle was the surprise left turn for me. The idea is that meat-heavy diets changed our guts and brain capacity. The expensive tissue hypothesis sounds elegant, maybe too elegant, but it does explain why ketones matter so much for the brain. He even said babies get into ketosis insanely fast, which is nuts. The brain seems far more flexible with fuel than people are told. So the old line that the brain mainly prefers glucose is too simplistic. A lot of health advice survives because it's neat, not because it's accurate. Science really does love a comfortable oversimplification. The controversial part was the plant-only diet and brain size point. He's tying nutrient density, omega-3s, and animal foods to brain health. That's where people instantly start throwing chairs at the screen. And I get why, because it pokes at a moral identity too. But his claim is basically that deficiency changes brain outcomes. He also clarified that some insulin resistance is actually normal. Puberty and pregnancy are the big physiological exceptions, which is important because not every resistant state is disease. That distinction alone saves the whole conversation from becoming cartoonish. And honestly, that's what makes this such a big idea. If one hormonal system can influence all these diseases, the map changes. It stops being 10 separate fires and starts being one electrical fault. Okay, that was my best serious metaphor, don't judge me. I'm not judging, I'm just admiring the chaos. The real question now is whether people can actually live differently. Because knowing the mechanism is one thing, changing breakfast is another. That's where everybody gets exposed, honestly. Episode 2 needs to get into what actually lowers insulin in real life. Because if the fix is simple, the resistance to it is the real story. And I already know that story is going to be messy. We should leave it there because the next part is the practical war. This one was the diagnosis, and the next one is the intervention. Teaser, episode 2 gets into the 4 pillars, the food fight, and the real fix. Wait, that insulin resistance is basically the tree and everything else is the branches? That's a dangerous idea because it makes the whole system look connected. Which is exactly why medicine hates it a little. Because if one root explains 10 diseases, the silo game gets embarrassed. And nobody likes being embarrassed by glucose. Right. Especially when the symptom is showing up everywhere at once. The crazy part is how casually he says Alzheimer's is brain insulin resistance. That rebrands it from random tragedy to a metabolic failure. But that also sounds almost too neat, doesn't it? Neat is not the same as wrong, though. No, but my brain always asks, what gets overused first? And his answer is always the same monster, insulin itself. The hormone everybody only remembers when dessert enters the room. That's so unfair, but yeah, that's how people think. I like the taxi analogy because it makes insulin feel active, not decorative. But the bouncer version was even better, because resistance is literally ignoring the knock. And then the body sends more bouncers like that is somehow a fix. Which is peak biology, honestly. More signal becomes the problem, and then the problem creates more signal. That loop is what makes it feel so hard to escape. Especially because people hear high insulin and only think good, at least sugar is controlled. But he keeps insisting high insulin is not a compliment. It is kind of wild that stress, inflammation, and over-insulinization can all create the same state. 6 hours is the part that got me, though. Like your body can get rude that fast? Apparently, yes, and then it can calm down just as fast if the trigger disappears. That distinction matters, because people assume all insulin resistance is one slow swamp. But he is drawing a line between quick, reversible resistance and the chronic version. The chronic version is the one with paperwork. That's exactly right, it feels bureaucratic. And then breakfast shows up like a silent villain. Because if you start the day with toast, jam, cereal, and coffee, you're already in a fight. And then lunch repeats the crime before insulin ever gets to rest. That 6 meals a day advice really sounds less innocent now. It sounds like an all-day insulin workout, not a healthy rhythm. No wonder people are exhausted and then told to snack again. The fat cell piece was maybe the most important thing for me. Because it's not just how much fat you have, it's how inflated the cells are. And he said women can have more fat yet be metabolically healthier. That flips the entire conversation people have about body fat. Right, because small fat cells are kind of flexible storage, while giant ones become angry. Angry fat is such a disgusting phrase, but it works. It really does sound like a villain origin story. And the ethnicity point is awkward but important, because the same gain hits different bodies differently. Which means BMI alone is doing a terrible job pretending to understand reality. I mean, we already knew BMI was lazy, but this makes it look cartoonish. Cartoonish is generous. The part about liposuction making things worse is brutal too. Because removing fat mass is not the same as fixing the storage system. Vanity surgery can end up leaving the metabolic mess intact. Or even worse, it can force the remaining fat cells to do more work. That type 1 diabetes example was insane to me. 10,000 calories and still not getting fat if there's no insulin? That's a massive challenge to the idea that calories alone are the boss. The Petri dish example nailed it because the cells were swimming in energy and still stayed small. Then insulin shows up and boom, they start storing like crazy. So insulin is not just the manager, it's the guy with the keys. Exactly, the whole building only moves when it arrives. Which is why low-carb meals changing fat storage is not some fringe trick. If the same calories can lead to different storage, the calories-only story is incomplete. That's where people start yelling thermodynamics like it's a courtroom. Thermodynamics always enters the chat like a very angry uncle. But he was careful there, because the energy is not disappearing. It's being spent or wasted differently. Metabolic rate going up by 300 calories is not small at all. That's basically an entire workout's worth of difference. And then ketones make the whole thing even stranger because you can literally exhale calories. Imagine losing weight by breathing your bank account away. That's a terrifyingly good line. The evolutionary detour was where he got a little spicy. The meat-heavy diet idea is basically saying our brains got bigger because our guts got cheaper. That sounds almost offensively simple, but also annoyingly plausible. Offensively simple is the best kind of biology. The ketone argument there was interesting too, because it makes fasting feel less like deprivation and more like fuel switching. And his claim that the brain can lean on ketones faster than people think is a big deal. It also makes the standard, the brain only runs on glucose line sound lazy. Lazy is being polite. The vegan brain-brain comparison was the most controversial thing in the whole stretch. But the deeper point is really about nutrient density, not internet culture war. Still, if your model demands supplements to patch the gaps, that tells you something. Exactly, because the body is not impressed by ideology. I also liked the distinction between pathological and physiological insulin resistance. Puberty and pregnancy as 2 times when resistance is actually supposed to happen makes a lot of sense. Because then insulin resistance stops sounding like a glitch and starts sounding like a tool. Which is a much scarier thought, honestly. A tool can protect you, or it can wreck you if it never turns off. That feels like the whole episode in one sentence. Yeah, and we barely survived the science without starting a food war. Which is why we need the next episode to get practical, not just provocative. Because understanding the root is cool, but changing the root is the real flex. Episode 2 is where this turns from theory into actual leverage. And that is where the messy part begins. Yeah, because once you know the mechanism, every meal starts talking back. Perfect place to leave it. Next time, we get into the 4 pillars and the real fight with breakfast. And we are absolutely not going to be polite about it. The crazy part is he makes one root explain half the clinic. That is either brilliant or annoyingly elegant. Like heart disease, fatty liver, brain stuff, even fertility. He is basically saying the branches look separate, but the tree is the same. That metaphor is doing Olympic lifts. And medicine keeps trimming leaves like it solved the forest. What hit you first, the scope or the insulin itself? The scope, because insulin was always sold as just blood sugar stuff. Then he starts talking blood vessels, ovaries, brain, and suddenly it gets personal. He really said the brain can be insulin resistant too. That phrase sounds fake until you hear him explain it. And the erectile dysfunction example is brutally specific. He does not waste time being delicate. But that bluntness is why it lands. The thing I keep circling is that insulin is not just a sugar manager. It is basically a whole-body energy traffic cop. A very aggressive traffic cop with a megaphone. And a lot of citations. The taxi analogy actually made it weirdly obvious. Glucose is riding, insulin is knocking, and tissues decide whether to answer. Which makes resistance sound less like a disease and more like a mutiny. Exactly, and then the body compensates by shouting louder with more insulin. That part is sneaky because high insulin is both cause and consequence. The body really does love a cursed feedback loop. Did you buy his fast lane and slow lane split? I did because it explains why some people look fine and are still a mess metabolically. 6 hours to change insulin sensitivity is wild. Stress, inflammation, and too much insulin can move that fast? That is the part I think people underestimate the most. Like sleep deprivation alone can nudge the whole system? Yeah, because cortisol and adrenaline are basically telling the body to brace for impact. The body hears danger and decides glucose should climb immediately, which is so rude to the pancreas. Then inflammation comes in and makes the glucose monitor look haunted. That flu example was a good reality check. People think a high reading is only about food, but sickness pushes it too. The body is basically saying, I am busy surviving, leave me alone. But the most controversial one was high insulin itself causing resistance. That is the one that flips everybody's mental model. Because we were taught insulin is always the good guy. And he is saying too much of a good signal becomes the problem. The toddler analogy was almost too relatable. Yes, the children training the parents into selective deafness. That is exactly how he framed the tissue becoming deaf to insulin. The food frequency part was scary too. If every meal is carbohydrate heavy, insulin never really gets a break. Breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack is not a recovery plan. It is a hostage situation with toast. And then that feeds the slow lane through fat cells getting bigger. The fat cell size point was way more interesting than fat mass, because two people can weigh differently and still have very different metabolic risk. The idea that women can carry more fat but be metabolically safer was a twist. More smaller fat cells versus fewer giant ones changes everything. And then ethnicity changes the storage threshold too. That was uncomfortable, but it sounded biologically real. Biology rarely cares about our comfort level. No, it is very disrespectful that way. His point was that the same fat gain can break one body faster than another. So the same 10 kilos is not the same story in every body. Exactly, because the available fat storage space is different. And then he went straight into type 1 diabetes and the insulin missing piece. That was a strong reminder that insulin is not optional if the body wants to store fat. The diabulimia example was grim but clarifying. It shows how powerful the insulin signal is for better and worse. And then the Petri dish story made it even harder to ignore. Calories were sitting there, but without insulin the cells stayed small. So energy alone does not tell the cell what to do. Right. Insulin is the instruction, calories are the material. That is such a cleaner way to say it than every diet argument online. The internet treats calories like a religion and hormones like a conspiracy. He clearly thinks hormones are the missing language. Did the lower carb, lower insulin, lower fat storage part convince you? It did, especially when he mentioned metabolic rate rising too. 300 calories a day is not a small footnote. That is basically a hidden workout without the gym bragging. A very expensive way to learn biology. The ketone part felt like the other half of the story. When insulin is low, the body starts burning and dumping energy instead of storing it. Breathing out calories is such a cinematic concept. The body said, I will simply exhale the problem. Then the evolution section made the whole thing bigger than weight loss. The expensive tissue hypothesis is actually kind of beautiful. Smaller gut, bigger brain, better fuel, more curiosity. We traded stomach real estate for thinking power. And ketones seem to be part of that brain fuel story. His baby ketosis example was intense, though. He was basically arguing that fat stores are not just aesthetics. They are neurodevelopmental fuel. The vegetarian brain claim is where people will throw chairs. He knows exactly where the chairs are coming from. But his omega-3 point at least made the mechanism more concrete. Still, that is going to trigger half the audience immediately. Great, now the comments section gets a metabolism and a moral identity crisis. Perfectly said. What I appreciated is that he did not treat insulin resistance like one disease. He treated it like a state the body can move into and out of. And then he separated the harmful version from the normal version in puberty and pregnancy. That distinction matters because otherwise people hear one scary word and panic. It also stops the whole conversation from becoming moralistic. Yeah, it is not good people eat this and bad people become resistant. Biology does not hand out virtue badges. It just responds to signals. That is probably the cleanest way to end episode 1. Root cause found, but the practical war still waits. And next episode is where we start asking what actually moves the needle. Which means breakfast is about to catch a lot of smoke. Good, it has been acting innocent for too long. We will get into the 4 pillars, the trade-offs, and the real-world fixes next time. Because now that the root is on the table, the game changes. That is the thing. Once you see insulin as a system signal, everything gets weird. It stops being a sugar story and starts being a whole-body traffic story. And suddenly the body is not broken. It is just receiving bad instructions. Exactly. And the scary part is how many diseases sit on that same wiring. Alzheimer's, blood pressure, fatty liver, infertility, all in one hallway. Which is almost too neat, so of course people argue with it. Medicine does love a separate folder for every problem. Right. And this guy is basically ripping the folders up. But his point is not mystical. It is just that the branches share a root. That root being insulin resistance, not just high glucose. Yes, and that distinction matters because insulin can be high before sugar looks bad. That is the sneaky part people miss. So the body is basically shouting for years before the lab report catches up? Pretty much. And that is why symptom chasing feels so inadequate. You can keep trimming branches and never touch the tree. That line is annoyingly good. The other big mind bender is that insulin is not just the blood sugar hormone. It is the body's energy dispatcher, right? Exactly, it tells muscles, fat, liver, and other tissues what to do with fuel. So when people say it is only about glucose, that is just tiny thinking. Tiny thinking is a brutal diagnosis. But accurate, because if blood vessels ignore insulin, that affects erectile function. And if ovaries ignore it, PCOS shows up. Right, and if the brain is insulin resistant, the consequences can look like cognitive decline. That is why the word hidden keeps coming up. Still, I want to push on the fast versus slow thing. Because 6 hours to insulin resistance sounds almost fake. It does sound fake until you hear stress, inflammation, and excess insulin do it. 6 hours is wild, honestly. Biology really said no need for patience. And the body can reverse it just as fast if the trigger is removed. So the fast lane is more like an alarm response? Yes, like the system is bracing for danger and temporarily stops listening. Cortisol and adrenaline push glucose up, insulin pushes it down, and the tug-of-war begins. Which means sleep deprivation and caffeine abuse are not just lifestyle quirks. They are metabolic signals, and the body is taking notes. The inflammation piece feels even more obvious in a weird way. Infection, autoimmune flares, even seasonal illness can spike glucose and worsen resistance. So your body is paying a metabolic tax while fighting something else. Exactly. And that makes the whole picture feel less like bad luck and more like load management. But the high insulin-causing resistance part is the most paradoxical one. It is, and yet it makes perfect sense if a signal never stops arriving. Even your kids eventually make you selectively deaf. That analogy was dangerously relatable. Chronic insulin becomes background noise, and the cells stop answering. So the body is not malfunctioning, it is adapting badly. Yes, and adaptation is why this gets stuck and becomes chronic. The food pattern side is where it becomes society-level trouble, though. Right, because if you eat all day, insulin never gets a break. Breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack is basically a hostage situation. The pancreas is doing overtime with no union. And a starchy breakfast is often the first punch. Toast, cereal, bagels, all that innocent-looking stuff. Innocent-looking carbs are the most dangerous kind of carbs. They really show up dressed for church and leave chaos behind. What I found interesting is the fat cell argument because it reframes obesity. It is not just how much fat you have, it is how stretched each cell gets. Exactly, and smaller fat cells are metabolically calmer than huge overloaded ones. So two people can have the same body fat and very different risk. Completely different risk, especially across ethnic groups with different fat cell storage patterns. That part always makes people uncomfortable, but biology does not care about comfort. Biology is not a panel discussion, and the practical consequence is huge because some groups hit metabolic trouble sooner, which means a weight chart can lie to you. A lot, yes, because the mirror and the lab are not always telling the same story. The liposuction point was brutal, by the way. He basically said removing fat cells can make future metabolism worse. If you remove storage capacity, the remaining cells get stressed faster. So vanity can become a metabolic bill you pay later. Yes, and that is why the fix is not cosmetic, it is systemic. The type 1 diabetes example was probably the most dramatic proof. Because without insulin, fat storage basically falls apart, which makes insulin sound almost like a fat growth permission slip. That is exactly the uncomfortable truth. And then calories decide how much raw material is even available. Right, you need both the signal and the supply for fat cells to grow. So calories are not irrelevant, just incomplete. Exactly, that is the smarter way to say it. The low-carb, low-insulin meal data is what really twists the knife. Same calories, different hormonal response, different storage outcome, and the metabolic rate can be hundreds of calories different too. Which means the body is not a simple calorie bucket. A very rude bucket, in fact. A bucket with opinions. The ketone part was also surprisingly elegant. When insulin is low, the body burns fat and literally wastes some fuel as ketones. So you breathe out calories. In a sense, yes, and that is why low insulin changes the whole energy economy. The evolutionary explanation makes that feel less random too. The idea is that nutrient-dense animal foods may have supported bigger brains and smaller guts. I know that is controversial, but it is at least intellectually interesting. It is controversial because food beliefs are emotional, not just scientific. The baby ketosis point was honestly kind of beautiful. A chubby baby is basically built to run on fat. And that shows ketones are not some fringe hack, they are a normal fuel, which makes the brain glucose-only idea sound outdated. Very outdated because the brain happily uses ketones when they are available. We have really reduced metabolism to one cartoon in school, and that cartoon has messed up decades of public thinking. The last distinction I want to keep clean is physiological versus pathological resistance. Puberty and pregnancy are not the enemy, they are the exception. Exactly, those are intentional, useful forms of resistance for growth and energy allocation. What we have been talking about is the harmful version that becomes chronic disease. That is the difference between a controlled fire and your kitchen catching fire. Beautifully said, and on that note we should probably stop before this turns into 3 more hours. Next episode is where we get into the 4 pillars and the real-world fixes. And that is where the arguments get useful because theory finally meets behavior. For now, the big takeaway is simple. The root matters more than the branch. We will pick this up in episode 2 and start asking what actually moves insulin.